So I think that we need to talk about Todd Bowden from Apt Pupil and Charlie Decker from Rage. Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name's Mel and I like to review books. So today's video isn't exactly going to be a book review, it's more of a character assessment of two characters across two different Stephen King books. So this came about because I recently finished reading the novella Apt Pupil, which was published in 1982 in the novella collection of Stephen King's, which is called Different Seasons. And I thought that this novella was really, really good. I think it's one of my favourite novellas of Stephen King's that I've ever read. So before we get into more details, I'm just going to say that there might be some spoilers in this video because it's going to be very difficult for me to compare the character in this novella to the character in another of his novels without me giving away some of the details. So just to make you aware of that before we carry on. So Apt Pupil's main character is a 13-year-old called Todd Bowden. And he's 13 years old when we start the book, and then he turns 14 during the course of the story. And we start out with Todd going round to deliver a paper to what we think is a stranger's house, and it's an elderly gentleman who answers the door, and the elderly gentleman goes by the name of Mr. Denker. However, when Todd hands him his paper, he says, "There you go, Mr. Dusander." And Mr. Denker is like, that's not my name, you can't read, and he's a little bit rude to Todd. So then Todd proceeds to tell him how he knows his name is Kurt Dusander and that he was the commander of a Nazi prison camp called Patton. Now this prison camp is made up for the purposes of this story, but there is reference to other real historical Nazi figures and places throughout the story. So that's, I suppose, a bit of a warning to anybody before they would go into reading this novel, just as a trigger warning that is primarily, like, we're talking about Nazi prison camps and the crimes that were committed against the Jews in this story, and that's like the basis of what the relationship is between Todd Bowden and Kurt Dusander. So we just say that right now. So you kind of realise then that Todd, tells Mr. Dusander, "I've been watching you for a while," and then he begins to tell him all these ways that he's managed to uncover the truth of who Mr. Denker actually is, that he's actually Kurt Dusander. And Mr. Dusander is a little bit incredulous at first, but then, like, Todd goes to tell him the length that he actually has a fingerprint dusting kit that his parents had bought him for Christmas because he wants to be a private detective when he's older, and they're always encouraging him to do the things that he wants to do. So he had taken fingerprints off Mr. Dusander's front door and postbox and actually matched them to fingerprints in the database that's held in, like, Interpol or somewhere, that's obviously looking for the old Nazi leaders. And obviously Mr. Denker has managed to get away. At this point in time, Mr. Denker is in his early 70s, so he's, like, managed to escape any kind of conviction for several decades basically, and now he's quite elderly, so nobody would really recognise him compared to the pictures that exist of him in his Nazi uniform when he is younger. Anyway, you sort of thinking, well, okay, Todd has found out who Mr. Denker is, so what's going to happen here? And I think this was the element of the story that really pulled me in, because I'm thinking, a 13-year-old has uncovered a criminal that other countries would extradite out of America to get hold of that criminal. So he's like a wanted man, like, internationally, So you're thinking, what can possibly happen here? And this is where the really, really creepy stuff starts to get in, because Todd basically says to Mr. Denker, "I want to know all about the crimes that you committed. I want to know what you did at Auschwitz, and what you did at Patton and all these other places." And Mr. Denker's like, "Well, I don't want to tell you." And Todd, he's sort of playing through his mind that the idea of blackmail for money sort of never really occurred to him, because he gets his paper round money and he gets an allowance off his parents, so he doesn't really need money for anything, and if he did, he'd go and mow a lawn, so he doesn't want money off Mr. Denker, because that's what Mr. Denker is thinking, that, you know, he's going to blackmail him for money. But he does still blackmail Mr. Denker. I just don't think Todd views it as blackmail because it's not for money. But he basically says to Mr. Denker, you need to tell me everything that you did, otherwise I'm going to tell people who you are. And essentially he does, you know, he has evidence, like he has fingerprints, so, you know, law enforcement could easily take the same fingerprints, you know, and he shows him all these photos of Mr. Denker when he's younger and has compared them with, you know, photos of him today. So that's, okay, you're like, okay, so he wants him to tell him all about it, and he says, you know, I don't want to tell anybody else about you necessarily, I just want to know what you did, you know, and you think, right, okay. But as this story starts to progress, we see the relationship progressing between Todd Bowden and Mr. Dusander, or Mr. Denker, whatever you want to call him, and essentially Todd is infatuated with Mr. Dusander, and it's not because he's horrified by what Dusander has done in his, you know, in his past. He seems morbidly obsessed with the details of the crimes that he forces Dusander to tell him about, and he seems to be like fetishizing what actually happened in those prison camps and what happened to those people. And it becomes really, really disturbing for the reader to think, like, okay, it's disturbing to think that anybody would want to, you know, take pleasure in listening to that or fetishizing, you know, those kind of criminal war activities. But Todd seems to be sort of getting off on it, you know, and he pretty much says this to Mr. Denker, who sort of, you know, is sort of side-eyeing Todd a little bit, thinking, okay, this, you know, he's a bit weird. But then there's a point in it where Todd buys an old Nazi uniform off the internet. It's kind of like, it's not exactly an old, but it's like a replica costume one. And he buys it for Dusander and tells him that he has to wear it while he's telling the story, which is really odd. You know, and in Todd's mind, we're kind of seeing this idea that he, you know, he wants Dusander to be the man that he had read about in the history books. He wants him to be this all-powerful person, but he's quite disappointed by the fact that the guy is elderly and actually, you know, bordering or is an alcoholic, and, you know, he wants to make him look more powerful, I think, while he's telling this story. And when Dusander actually puts on this outfit in the end, because Todd manipulates him into doing it and says, you know, if you don't do it, then I'm going to go and tell everybody who you are. You know, so he's like bullying Dusander in a way to do what he wants to do in the way that he wants him to do it. And that's really, really worrying, and we can actually see that manipulative behaviour from Todd here. So whilst Dusander is a terrible character in the sense that he has committed some absolutely heinous crimes, you know, throughout his early career in the Nazi party, so you shouldn't feel like you want to have any empathy for him, and I don't think that I had empathy, but it's clear to me that Todd is manipulating Mr. Dusander in a way that he's getting off on it, so that it's almost like, it's like he views Mr. Dusander as one of the most powerful people that ever lived, that he sort of idolises, but because he's got him in a corner and he knows that if the authorities know who Mr. Dusander is, and Mr. Dusander could get extradited and potentially executed for the crimes that he has done, he's using that to his advantage to be in charge of Dusander. And I think that's what's getting him off, is that idea that he's a really powerful grown-up and now I have power over him. So both of these characters are actually really sickening, and they don't really like each other. But, you know, Todd keeps going around to Dusander's house because he wants to know more and more details of what's going on, and Dusander can't really do anything about it because otherwise Todd's going to tell everybody who he is. But then, you know, the manipulation continues. So Mr. Dusander has to go and have dinner with Todd's parents because they're interested in who Todd is spending all his time with. You know, so they kind of pretend that he's part blind and that Todd is spending his time reading books to him. So this is the first time that Todd then, like, you know, we see him actively manipulating his parents so he can spend time with Dusander. And then, you know, at another point his grades are really falling because he's spending so much time with Dusander, and all he's doing is daydreaming about these crimes that Dusander has committed, and imagining himself being the perpetrator of those crimes as well. And you know, he starts to have like sexual dreams as well that include this kind of thing, which is very, very disturbing. And actually, you know, it's his first erection that he's aware of from a wet dream is from a dream where he's imagining the crimes that Dusander is committing, but he's the perpetrator, like he's doing that, or he's somehow a front row witness to it, which is really, really disturbing. But this is obviously killing his grades at school. So essentially his teachers write a note to his parents and say, you know, we really need to see you because, you know, something's wrong with Todd. And basically he may not pass the year if you don't come in to see us. So Todd absolutely wants nothing to do with this. So he, in the end, gets Mr. Dusander to go and pretend to be his granddad and go and speak to the teachers so that his parents never find out about his failing grades. And then he also gets his report cards and he uses like ink eraser to then write in new grades, so they're never aware of the trouble that he's in. So Todd is like manipulating all of the grown-ups around him constantly throughout this book. And you know, you really shouldn't sort of think, oh, I dislike a 13 or a 14-year-old, but Todd is showing some really, really disturbing behaviour. And then as he, you know, ages and gets a little bit older, Mr. Dusander essentially has an accident and he ends up, well, basically Dusander is also having dreams as a result of telling these stories to Todd. So in order to make his brain quieten down, he's found that if he goes out and murders vagrants and animals, that makes him feel better. Meanwhile, Todd is kind of doing the same thing, not that he's telling Dusander this, but he's actually going out and begins murdering, you know, helpless vagrants that he finds, and he thinks that nobody's going to find out that he's done what he's done. And actually nobody would be looking at a kid, to be honest, thinking that they'd have murdered anybody. And because these people don't really have anybody to miss them, these crimes go on for some time. And initially the papers are sort of blaming them for killing each other, like, you know, vagrants killing vagrants. But actually you've got two different killers who are killing the vagrant population. You've got Mr. Dusander and you've also got, you know, Todd. So that is, you know, he is escalating basically throughout of this book. It's like, you know, he starts off when he first is Dusander as quite a clever child with a lot of intellect, and then as it goes on he's becoming more and more mature and creepy and scary, and he's escalating in the rage that he seems to have inside of him because he's now actually needing to take that out on people. However, Mr. Dusander is killing somebody one day and ends up having a heart attack, so he has to, you know, call Todd to get Todd to come and help him, because essentially he can't call an ambulance until the body has been buried. So therefore Todd now has to get involved with that, so that is a way that Dusander can now manipulate Todd to sort of stay on his side. So again, they continue with this kind of really weird relationship where they're like linked to each other because of everything that the other one knows. And Dusander's sort of saying to Todd now, you can't possibly tell people now that you know about me, because essentially you are accessory to knowing that I was here in this country and you didn't say anything for many years. So basically Todd sort of dreams of killing Dusander, but he knows that he can't. Anyway, after Dusander has died, you know, in this book, it then comes out that he is an ex-Nazi war criminal, and it's all over the papers. So obviously people now start to look at Todd because, like, well, you spent a lot of time with this guy, how did you not know this? And so he now has to manipulate police officers and all the people around him that, you know, he didn't know what had happened. But it's becoming more and more obvious that he did. So the teacher at his school who had met Mr. Dusander, who thought it was his grandfather, sees his picture in the paper and he's like, no, that's wrong. So he goes around to try and talk to Todd about this, and Todd just shoots him outright. And then Todd goes on a shooting spree basically at the end of the book, and apparently it takes several hours to catch him. So like, what I would say when I'm reading this book, like, you know, I kind of looked up what the definition of a psychopath was, like, for this book, because essentially this seems to me to be Todd, you know. And if we sort of look, I've got some notes down here, so I'm just going to refer to them, but if we sort of look at this, Todd has absolutely no respect for his parents throughout of this book. He doesn't really seem to respect his mother or his father. But he's very outwardly charming to them, so they have no idea of his dislike of them, his lack of respect for them. However, from what I can tell, he's had a very good upbringing, and he's had a very privileged upbringing. His parents have pretty much given him whatever he wants. The only thing that I would say is that his parents have allowed him maybe too much of what he wants, so they've never seemed to be people that said no to him. And there is actually a scene where, you know, his father is saying to him, oh, I think you should spend less time with Mr. Denker. And then he talks about how he thought he saw rage in Todd's face, but then thought, no, he's never angry. And then he sort of congratulates himself for the fact that his son never gets angry. And you think, well, actually anger is a healthy emotion, so maybe he should have encouraged that in his son. His parents put a lot of pressure on him to get high grades as well. So, you know, we have that aspect of it, but they're very loving, and they don't seem to have abused him like physically in any way. You know, Todd also has no respect for authority. That's really clear throughout the whole book. He's extremely manipulative. We have multiple instances of him manipulating everybody around him. He's very egocentric. Like, he, you know, when he's getting Dusander to tell him what's going on, you know, what happened, when he's getting him to wear that Nazi uniform, it's for his benefit, so he can enjoy the show more of what Dusander's telling him. So he's completely oblivious to the suffering of all of these, you know, poor victims of this regime. He doesn't seem to have any empathy for them whatsoever. You know, he tries to bully Dusander, obviously. He seems very detached from other people's suffering. Yeah, at the same time, as all of these horrible characteristics that I can see and that Dusander can see, because obviously he can see into Todd and see how awful Todd is, but he's kind of built the same way as Todd. But he seems normal to everybody else. Like, his parents think he's utterly normal. His teachers think that he's utterly normal. You know, and he, even when the police officers at the end of this book are a little bit suspicious about what he might know about what Kurt Dusander did in the past, they're actually having a conversation saying, yeah, but he's really charming and he'll just say this or he'll just say this. He's coming across as completely normal. He knows how to play the game. So, you know, he sort of brings, you know, to question, is Todd a psychopath? And did Todd become this because of what he learned from Dusander? Or was he already this way inclined? And I would like to think, well, I wouldn't like to think, but I'd like to say that I think he was already that way inclined, because the lengths that he went to prior to meeting Dusander to find out Dusander's identity, there was a lot of manipulation in that, but he's also very careful about what he was doing and while he was doing it. And the reason that he actually found out about this is he'd come across a box of magazines in his friend's garage that had all these pictures in of, you know, like Nazi encampments and what had happened in them. And he seemed to be getting off on reading those magazines because he's sort of talking about this to Dusander. So it seems to me that he, maybe for a couple of years before he met Dusander and knew who Dusander was, finding those magazines unlocked that side of him. And then I think that when he'd actually met Dusander, then he, you know, he had the opportunity to have that power over Dusander, and, you know, then, you know, he started to grow as a psychopath and become worse and worse and worse and worse. So, you know, you sort of think nature or nurture, and it feels like his parents have actually been fairly good parents. I feel like he was probably not empathetic, and he was probably very egocentric, and, you know, cold all along, really. And then just, you know, meeting Dusander, meeting somebody who's like him, has just like completely opened the floodgates, if you like, and he has evolved into not only a psychopath but a spree killer before the, you know, he's even got into his early adulthood, really. So, you know, this is quite a it's quite a, how should I put it, it's a very disturbing book, but it's also a very sad book when we think about, you know, that somebody like Todd could have that much rage. And I think that what it made me think about when I was reading this book, because there's a lot of sexual gratification on Todd's behalf in his, like, when he's thinking about wanting to hurt people or killing the vagrants or killing the animals, he's got like sexual gratification and he's got this rage sort of building in him. And this book reminded me of another book of Stephen King's, which was published under the name Richard Bachman, and the book was called Rage. So Rage was actually published in 1977, which was 5 years before Apt Pupil. However, the manuscript for Rage was finished in 1971, so that's nearly 9 years before its publication. And it was started much earlier than that. Rage was actually started when Stephen King was in high school, and he was a high school student himself. So I find that there's a couple of similarities between these two books. Now, as I say, Rage was published under the name Richard Bachman, but we all know that it was Stephen King, and this book has since been pulled from publication. So Stephen King asked for Rage to be pulled from publication in 1997, so 20 years after it had been published. He actually said that he didn't want it to be published in the Bachman books anymore. So the publishers honoured his wishes, and now today you cannot buy a new copy of Rage. The only way you can get hold of Rage is if you are to buy a second-hand copy. So I do have a second-hand copy of that, so I have been able to read it. I've heard various things about why Stephen King pulled Rage off the shelves, and a part of it was apparently to do with there was a couple of spree shootings in high schools during the 90s, and apparently one of those spree shooters had been found with a copy of this in their locker. Now, I'm not entirely sure how true that is, because, you know, I don't know how to verify that information. It's just what I've read online. But it seemed that Stephen King was a little bit worried about, was this inspiring anybody to do anything that they shouldn't be doing? So that seems like a smart reason to remove the book. But I have also read him saying that he didn't think that Rage was his best work, and that was another reason why he wanted it pulled off the shelves, because it's just not as sophisticated as his other work. And that's to be expected, actually, because Rage is technically, I think, the first thing that he ever wrote. And although Carrie got published first, he actually wrote Rage before Carrie. It just didn't get published until much later. Now, having read Rage, I sort of think that Rage is very classic Bachman, in the sense that, you know, our characters, you know, they're young male characters usually, and they always have like a lot of sexual tension in them. And we get that because our main character, Charlie Decker, who's the main character in Rage, he is a high school senior. Now, high school finishes at a different age in America compared to the UK. So in the UK, that would put you at about 15 or 16 years old. But I think in America, it actually puts you at 17 or 18 years old if you're a high school senior. So this means that he's a handful of years older than Todd Bowden, who is our main character from Apt Pupil. Now, Charlie Decker basically holds his entire class hostage with a gun. He goes into school one day and he has a meeting with his head teacher, who is called Mr. Denver. Now, I find that name very similar to Mr. Denker, so this is why I kind of am doing a little bit of a contrast here, because I sort of feel like Rage might have been a first time of trying to write about a young man going off the rails, and then Apt Pupil was maybe the more sophisticated story that came later on after Rage. So yeah, he has this meeting with his head teacher, Mr. Denver, and Mr. Denver is basically saying, you know, you need some help, you need some counselling, you need to book, you know, your ideas up, because essentially Charlie had attacked one of his teachers with a weapon. I think it was like a wrench or something, but he had done so much damage to this teacher had had to be in hospital and had to have time off. And Charlie is very, very rude. He's absolutely not taking what the principal is saying to him. He's just trying to wind the principal up. He walks off out the office and then continues to his algebra class, takes a gun with him and kills his algebra teacher. And then essentially the class are now all locked in with him with a gun, and yeah, they sit out for a couple of hours in this hostage situation. So you have the police obviously outside of the school, and you have the head teacher who is occasionally trying to rig down into the classroom to try and liaise with Charlie to, you know, talk him out of you know, the situation that he's got himself into. Now what's interesting is Charlie never actually physically hurts one single student in that class, although he does shoot another man as well, so he actually ends up killing 2 people on this day. And with the head teacher, whenever the head teacher rings the classroom, Charlie is just absolutely vile to him, tries to provoke him and wind him up, and set like mind traps for him so that he will try and make out like he's going to shoot somebody because of something the head teacher has said. He has absolutely no like at all for this head teacher. He has no regard for authority or whatsoever, and this becomes really clear. Now when he sat in the classroom with the other kids are obviously scared at first, but as things progress, he essentially gets them to start talking to each other and has a sort of rough justice system going on where he realises these 2 girls that don't like each other, so he draws a big circle on the floor and essentially they have to take it in turns to verbally insult each other, and then they can slap each other, and then it's the next one's turn until eventually they tire themselves out and, you know, give it up. He basically, you know, is like pointing guns at people and telling them that they have to tell him, you know, why this or why that, and he actually gets some of them to reveal like their what they've been doing sexually in the last few years of their lives and things like that, which is, again, he seems to sort of be getting off on this, but we also learn a little bit about Charlie during this time as well. So he actually hasn't sexually had that much luck. He seems to have had some impotency when he was in a situation where he wanted to have sexual contact with somebody, but then he's talking about how actually then later on he had very violent, disturbing dream about a woman, and then was able to get an erection. So again, we can sort of see a bit of a parallel between Charlie and Todd here, in that Charlie is getting off on other people's discomfort, and he is sexually getting aroused by violence and abuse towards other people, and he's actually dreaming about that as well. And you know, that's sort of in line with Todd, really. So one of the things I find really interesting about the Rage book is that as the, you know, the children, I'll say the children because they're sort of young adults, are sort of talking to each other and airing all their grievances out between each other. There's like this one particular kid, Ted, who was quite popular before they started, and you know, Charlie absolutely, you know, keeps going for him and lets the others keep going for him to take him down a peg or two, you know. But they sort of have the opportunity, I think, at one point where they could actually overpower Charlie and get out of this situation, but they don't. They actually begin to start to agree with some of what Charlie is saying about, you know, his dislike for authority and, you know, what's actually going on in the world. And he actually, yeah, you almost think like the other people in the classroom, there's quite a few of them that are actually on his side. Which I think was one of the most disturbing things of the book for me, is that he's literally gone in, killed several people, held them all up hostage, and then has actually managed to manipulate them round into his way of thinking. So that was quite disturbing. But to give credit to this as well, at the end of the book, he's committed, he's not found sane to stand trial, but somebody writes him a letter while he's away who was from the classroom and says that basically that they missed him, you know, good fight, we miss you. So that kind of like lends credit to the fact that he had convinced people around his way of thinking. So yeah, like obviously in the end it all goes down. He gets shot by snipers that are like around the school to try and take him down, and they do shoot him, but he obviously survives because there's then like a thing in the book which then is talking about him not being able to stand trial because he's found to be clinically insane. It doesn't, however, say in what way he's found to be clinically insane. And this is where I think there's an ever such a slight difference between Todd and Charlie. Now, I am not a psychiatrist, I am not trained in psychology or anything like that, so I can only go by what I have read on the internet, so I'm just going to put that disclaimer there. This is just meant to be a fun, light-hearted conversation about these two characters and me trying to do a small compare. It's not meant to be any kind of anything serious, okay? But I would say that Charlie is not a psychopath necessarily, he might be a sociopath because he has a disregard for the rights and safety of others. Now that is clear because essentially he has total disregard for all the adults around him for their safety. He doesn't really care about the safety of the people in the classroom either, and he clearly has a disregard for them all. Impulsivity and rage. Yes, he's clearly impulsive. We already know that he's beaten a teacher up in one lesson before, and now, you know, he's annoyed after he's been pulled into the head teacher's office, so has just decided to go on a shooting spree. And this is a key difference, I think, between Charlie and Todd. So even though Todd went on a shooting spree at the end, Todd only went on a shooting spree because he was forced into a corner and he knew that it was over. So he basically, I think, just wanted to take out as many people as he could with him. But he used to think very carefully about all of the situations. He was not really that impulsive as a person. He was planning everything, whereas Charlie is very impulsive and doesn't really seem to plan these things and just lets his internal rage get the better of him. Lack of empathy and remorse. Yes, he has absolutely no remorse for the people that he's hurt. He doesn't really care about the people that he's taunting. He doesn't care about the head teacher that he's taunting on the phone. Irresponsibility. I would say that he's quite an irresponsible character. But what I would say as well in this is one of the difference, again, between Charlie and Todd. Todd seems to have had a fairly good upbringing and seems to have had fairly decent parents. But Charlie has had a very fractured childhood and has not got on with his father as well as he'd have liked. His father seems to have very high masculine standards that Charlie doesn't feel that he has met or can meet. And his dad has also come across as quite a violent individual from some of the stories that Charlie tells in the class. But that violence is not necessarily just towards Charlie as well. We get the impression that he has been sexually violent towards Charlie's mother as well. However, Charlie does seem to still have some attachment to his mother and some love for his mother in some of the small things that he sort of says about her through the book, whereas Todd doesn't really seem to care that much about his mother. So when we look at what the difference is between, you know, sociopathy and, you know, psychopathy, I found this on the internet, so I'll just read it out. Sociopathy is typically associated with more impulsive, erratic behaviour and a slightly stronger, though still very weak, capacity for emotional attachment compared to the calculated, cold nature of a psychopath. So, you know, I found that on the internet because I sort of asked the internet, you know, like, what is the difference between the two, because they seemed like quite similar to me. But after reading that, I was thinking, well, actually, I feel like Charlie is more of a sociopath, which can also be known as like anti-social disorder, and whereas Todd seems more of a psychopath, which is basically just have no empathy whatsoever, and, you know, is quite calculating and carefully planning what they're doing and not really that impulsive. Now, I thought these two stories were like really good actually to talk together because, as I said, when I read Apt Pupil, I started to think this feels very Bachman in a way, and actually it was published during the time that Stephen King was publishing books under the name of Richard Bachman. So, you know, it's obviously the same person, but I have always thought that the Bachman books have got this grittier, more sexually violent aspect to them. Now, because Todd is ever so slightly younger, that sexual fetishization is not quite written in the same way as like our 17 and 18-year-old characters, because, you know, we've got the characters in The Long Walk as well, which are like about 17, 18 years old, and they're quite sexually motivated and driven as well, although albeit in a different way to these two characters. But you sort of get that grittiness, I think, of frustrated youth that's angry and horny in the Bachman novels. Whereas in Stephen King's other work, that doesn't necessarily come through. I don't think sex is really such a big thing. And whilst it's not in Apt Pupil, it's just the fact that that's what's sort of driving Todd a little bit. Did remind me very much of kind of the Bachman style of writing. And then the fact that, you know, both of our young main characters in this seem to have this inner rage, and, you know, they have gone on basically a gun rampage, both of them do in the end. It just made me think actually that they were quite similar in some ways, and I did kind of feel like maybe Apt Pupil was another take on what I suppose Stephen King was trying to do with Rage, but Rage was published under the pseudonym, obviously, Richard Bachman at the time. So when Apt Pupil actually came out, nobody knew that Stephen King had actually written Rage as well. And then obviously Rage got pulled off from publication like 20 years after it was published. You know, and another reason why Stephen King might be thinking, well, actually I've got Apt Pupil, which, although it's not exactly the same story, it's of a similar vein, I think, but I also think that it's a more sophisticated story. The way that it's put together with Mr. Denker, or Dusander, as you might want to call him. So yeah, I just really wanted to talk about that, and I'd be really interested if any of the rest of you have read both of these. Have you read Rage and have you read Apt Pupil? And did you see any crossover yourself or feel any crossover in the two characters? Because I don't think I've ever really seen anybody talk about that, and it's only probably by chance because I read Rage maybe about 3 months ago, so it wasn't really that long ago, so that might have been still fresh in my mind when I was reading Apt Pupil. Now I have to admit, I preferred Apt Pupil to Rage. I think that I just preferred the way the characters were written in Apt Pupil, if I'm honest, and I thought that the story was, you know, it was quite clever. The way that it had been put together, and it kind of sucked me in straight away from the first page when, you know, Todd had knocked on Mr. Denker's door. But with Rage, I sort of started reading it. I didn't dislike it, but really I think I was reading it because, you know, it had been pulled and I wanted to know, okay, what's really in this book? You know, and I didn't find it to be a bad story, but it wasn't a page turner. It wasn't something like sucked me in from the beginning. So, you know, I'd definitely give Apt Pupil a 5. I'd probably give Rage like 3.5. So yeah, I do feel that the quality is better in Apt Pupil, but both very interesting character studies of their main characters. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please press the like button, and if you'd like to see any of my future content, please press the subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye!